The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the subcommittee on terrorism and illicit finance may participate in today's hearings. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled Low Cost, High Impact, Combating the Financing of Lone Wolf and Small-Scale Terrorist Attacks. I now recognize myself for 2 minutes to give an opening statement. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today's hearing will examine issues concerning small-scale acts of terrorism and the mechanism used to fund this type of terrorism. Although overall numbers remain low, one study has found that since the 1970s, lone wolf attacks have grown almost 50% in the United States and by over 400% in other Western countries. Law enforcement, as well, has previously expressed concern that there is a greater likelihood of lone wolf terrorism than large-scale attack in the United States. One of the likely reasons is the relatively low cost for funding such an attack. Roughly 75% of extremist terrorist plots in Europe occurring between 1994 and 2013 average a cost of just $10,000. As we'll hear today, whether an act of terrorism is directly funded by a known terrorist group or carried out by a sympathizer, the relatively low financial cost presents a hurdle to tracking the movement of funding through the financial system. Whether it be through petty crime, working a temporary job, misappropriating government benefits, or engaging in scam transactions, terrorist organizations are utilizing new means to finance their operations and are increasingly turning to newer financial technologies as well as less traditional transfer methods to move their funds. As we have seen a change in tactics to lone wolf terrorist acts, what is clear, however, is that the cooperation between policymakers, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and financial institutions is necessary to detect, identify, and disrupt the funding of those actors. In today's hearing, I hope our witnesses can discuss how we are currently combating terrorism and illicit finance, including what tools and partnerships are working well in the effort to detect and disrupt lone wolf and small cell attacks. I would also appreciate any comments about deficiencies in our system that may impede our fight against terrorist finance. Finally, I would welcome a discussion about the new and innovative technological solutions that are being developed to help tackle this problem. Inhibiting terrorist financing is not a new problem, but I hope that today we can shed some light on this issue and help inform this subcommittee on ways which we can help disrupt that flow of money. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Look forward to their expert testimony on this very important issue. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses for being here today. This subcommittee takes on some difficult but important issues. In recent years, we've seen a rise in lone actor terrorist attacks. While these terrorists are often inspired by extremist ideologies, they have little to no specific help from terrorist organizations, and the attacks are often self-financed, making them more difficult to uncover and prevent. We have seen lone actor terrorists can be radicalized by foreign as well as domestic extremism. In the San Bernardino shooting, Orlando nightclub attack, and Boston Marathon bombing, the terrorists were inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. However, in Charleston church shooting, the car attack in Charlottesville, and the Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado Springs, the terrorists were motivated by domestic extremism. Regardless of the source of radicalization, we must look for ways to prevent the financing of these kinds of activities. The low cost of these attacks can be challenging to our current anti-terrorism financial protocols, but that doesn't make them any less important to stop. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses on how to recognize financial patterns in small-scale terrorism, how the government or financial institutions can better block extremist networks, and other ideas on how to disrupt lone actor terrorism financing. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Perlmutter, for hosting today's hearing on combating lone wolf terrorism and small-scale terrorist attacks. I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists for lending their expertise to our subcommittee, particularly Mr. Reynolds. Thank you for your engagement in working with us and traveling other countries to carry the important message of terrorism finance and how we can prevent that from the bad guys getting the money. Last Congress, I pursued legislation that would punish those who moved to support lone wolf terrorists. Furthermore, I will continue to pursue legislation that arms law enforcement and assist our partners abroad to mitigate the impact of potential terrorist attacks. Lone wolf and small-scale terrorist attacks continue to threaten the United States and the rest of the world. It is important that we continue to track illicit finance and illegal transactions by cooperating with the private sector to thwart these bad actors. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and thank you for holding this hearing today. This subcommittee has held a number of important hearings during its inaugural session, and today's topic will hopefully help us better understand and address what seems to be a shift in the way acts of terror and violence are carried out. While we will never forget the images of a large-scale attack like the one we witnessed almost 16 years ago against the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, there is an increased and concerning pattern of smaller, less coordinated attacks around the globe. Less than a month ago, a terrorist using a rented cargo van targeted and killed 14 people in a popular tourist location in Barcelona, Spain. Just over a year ago, on September 17, 2016, a suspected terrorist wielding kitchen knives wounded 10 people at a shopping mall in my district in Minnesota. The attacker was fortunately subdued by the heroic actions of another Minnesotan before any innocent lives were lost. However, areas of recreation and enjoyment must now be viewed as potential soft targets where even the most common household items can be used as a weapon. Our financial institutions have and will continue to play a critical role in the fight against terrorism. As food and water are essential to sustaining life, terror organizations need financing and resources to further their agenda of violence and hate. We must continue our efforts to deprive them of these essential resources, and we must constantly evolve as the threats facing our nation so often do. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and working with my colleagues on this subcommittee to find ways we can partner with our financial services sector to better track and defeat small-dollar, small-scale acts of terror in the future. Thank you, and I yield back the remaining balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now welcomes each one of our witnesses today. To introduce Mr. Moreno, I would like to recognize Representative Lee Zeldin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Joseph Moreno is a partner in the White Collar Defense and Investigations Group at the law firm of Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft. Mr. Moreno rejoined Cadwallader after serving at the U.S. Department of Justice in the National Security Division's Counterterrorism Section, where he investigated and prosecuted international money laundering, material support, structuring, and terrorist financing cases. He was also appointed a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, where he prosecuted a wide variety of criminal cases regarding the Classified Information Procedures Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the USA Patriot Act. In 2014, Mr. Moreno was appointed as a consultant to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he served on the staff of the FBI 9/11 Review Commission. Prior to joining his current firm, Mr. Moreno was an associate in the Structured Finance and White-Collar Crimes Group at the law firm Skadden Arps. Mr. Moreno earned his undergraduate degree in political science cum laude from Stony Brook University in the greatest congressional district in America, New York 1, and his J.D. cum laude from St. John's University School of Law. A decorated combat veteran, Mr. Moreno is a lieutenant colonel in U.S. Army Reserves, and I was honored to serve with Mr. Moreno because we were in the same Army Reserve unit until recently. Thank you, and I yield back.
Dr. Matt Levitt, I understand that you have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. Okay, so at that time, we'll excuse you. The rest of you are good till 7? Okay, that's checking. That was a little grimace there. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Levitt is the director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute. From 2008 through 2009, he served as State Department Counterterrorism Advisor to the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security From 2005 to early 2007, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. From 2001 to 2005, Dr. Levitt served the Washington Institute as founding director of its terrorism research program, which was established in the wake of the September 11th attacks. Previously, he served as counterterrorism intelligence analyst at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dr. Levitt holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Yeshiva University, as well as a master's degree in law and diplomacy and a doctorate from Tufts University Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thank you for being here, Dr. Levitt. Mr. Seamus Hughes is a deputy director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. Mr. Hughes previously worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, serving as lead staffer on the U.S. government effort to implement a national countering violent extremism strategy. Prior to NCTC, Mr. Hughes served as a senior counterterrorism advisor for the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. While on the Hill, Mr. Hughes authored numerous legislative bills, including sections of the 9/11 Commission Recommendations Act and the Special Agent Samuel Hicks Families of Fallen Heroes Act. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland and a recipient of the National Security Council Outstanding Service Award and 2 NCTC Directors Awards for outstanding service. Mr. Hughes also teaches classes at George Washington University and Georgetown University. Thank you for being here, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Frederick Reynolds is Global Head of Financial Crime for Barclays. Mr. Reynolds joined Barclays from Bank of America, where he was FIU executive and was responsible for global AML investigations, global AML detection and monitoring, risk data analytics, and AML behavior modeling. Prior to entering the private sector, Mr. Reynolds served as the Deputy Director of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. Prior to being appointed the Deputy Director of FinCEN from 2010 through 2012, he was Deputy Chief of the Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering Section at the Department of Justice, where he oversaw numerous high-profile money laundering and financial crime cases, including ones involving Mexican cartels, terrorist financing, and transnational organized crime. From 2006 to 2010, Mr. Reynolds was a federal prosecutor at DOJ, where he investigated and prosecuted high-profile cases involving significant money laundering, financial crime, and violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Bank Secrecy Act. Prior to joining DOJ, Mr. Reynolds was the Assistant Attorney General for the Republic of Palau and a litigation associate for several private firms. Mr. Reynolds has an undergraduate degree from Brandeis University and a law degree from Emory University School of Law. Each one of you will now be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Levitt, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Perlmutter, distinguished
You
members.
might make sure your mic is on and turned around and up close.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce,
That's better.
Ranking Member Perlmutter, distinguished members of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee. It's an honor and a privilege to testify before you today. Unlike large attacks orchestrated over time by large groups, lone offender and small group attacks can be carried out very quickly with minimal funding and preparation. The result is that in some cases, authorities can be denied both the lag time within which they can run an effective investigation and the benefit of key traditional tripwires, like the ability to follow travel, communications, and financial trails that in the past have proved to be especially productive lines of investigative inquiry. Lone offenders and small groups their attacks are on the rise, especially coming on the heels of explicit calls by groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda for like-minded followers to carry out attacks in their home countries. ISIL has been pushing such attacks for years now. In an online 2015 book entitled How to Survive in the West, a Mujahid Guide, the group argued, and I quote, "With less attacks in the West being group networked attacks and an increasing amount of lone wolf attacks, it will be more difficult for intelligence agencies to stop an increasing amount of violence and chaos from spreading in the West." The terrorist threat from lone offenders and small groups is also magnified by the phenomenon of returning foreign terrorist fighters. Some of these battle-hardened fighters will move on to new battlefronts. Some may return disgruntled and disillusioned. Some are sure to return intending to do harm. The 2015 National Terrorist Financing Assessment Risk notes one case from Houston of an individual planned to travel abroad to fight radical groups with radical groups in Syria by using an expected tax refund to cover his expenses. The same types of simple funding could also underwrite attacks at home. And this includes there are a variety of trends that we need to look at here. As you've all mentioned, the low cost of attacks are one particular issue. The self-financing is another. That can be using your own salary, and there's nothing at all suspicious about that. It could be small-scale crime. It could be borrowing money from family or friends, either with or without the knowledge that it intends to do some harm. Just last week, an Uzbek man in Brooklyn pled guilty to conspiring to provide material support to the Islamic State in a related case. There are legal and illegal financial loans. But one of the things I think is most interesting is that the idea of the lone wolf is actually a little bit of a misnomer. In more cases, people are known wolves rather than lone wolves, either from what they're posting on social media or from what they're telling their close friends and family, or from external activities. External support continues to be something that is a useful line of investigation. Last month, U.S. investigators uncovered an ISIS financial network that was transferring money to an operative in the U.S. through false eBay transactions. The recipient, Mohammed El-Shinawi in Maryland, pretended to sell printers on eBay as a cover for the payments he was receiving through PayPal and Western Union for operational purposes in the United States. And the UN Security Council has reported that despite military pressure and falling revenues, ISIL-Core continues to send funds to affiliates worldwide using a combination of money or value transfer services and the transport of bulk cash. This transferring of money is an opportunity for us, even with small-scale incidents. The UN Security Council report goes on to note that ISIL-Core has sent money to places where it does not have affiliates, which according to a member state assessment is an attempt to prepare for its eventual military defeat in Syria and Iraq. In other words, not only is ISIL preparing to move funds to its other provinces, it's also moving funds to other places where newly inspired followers or returning foreign terrorist fighters can use or access ISIL funds to carry out attacks. Australian officials report similar issues. The bottom line is that countering homegrown financing is not something new. The 9/11 Commission report specifically talked about how, while terrorists have shown considerable creativity in how they move money, we've had some success. But over time, if some of their terrorist operations do not require as much outside money, they may be more self-funding, either through legitimate employment or low-level criminal activity. We should have anticipated this coming. And therefore, there are several things that we could be thinking about. First is that lone offenders and small groups, they still need money. And despite the challenges noted above, even the Financial Action Task Force underscores that their need for money means we have opportunities. Consider the case of Darren Barrow in the UK, where financial trails played one small part in identifying who he was. He was only known as Isam al-Hindi and thwarted his plot several years ago to blow up a limousine filled with gas canisters in the city of London. Second, the private sector has access to tremendous financial information and could be better positioned to act on it and share it with us if we provided them greater insight. Now, in the U.S. government, we do this type of thing all the time. We assess and reassess what the trends are. FinCEN does this all the time in terms of updating its automated business rules that it develops in terms of how it and its partners search Bank Secrecy Act information. And there's a lot more that we could be doing here, and a great example is the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force that is a great example in the UK. And finally, financial intelligence is not going to solve all of your problems. And there will be some cases in a true lone wolf situation where someone has no connectivity to others and is taking money out of their own bank account, and this particular tool set will not be as effective. But FINIT continues to surprise. In one instance, financial intelligence helped the U.S. Air Force determine what oil refineries to target in Iraq and Syria. And so we should not rule this out as a tool that will no longer be effective. We just have to find new ways to partner with the private sector to make it as effective as possible. Thank you very much.
The chair would now recognize Mr. Moreno for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pierce, Vice Chairman Pittenger, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the invitation to appear before you today. It is truly an honor to be part of this discussion. Since the attacks of September 11th, we have been largely successful in preventing the next catastrophic attack and have prosecuted hundreds of financiers, facilitators, and charities for supporting terrorism. However, as pointed out, identifying and preventing lone wolf or small-scale terrorist attacks presents a unique set of challenges. Lone wolf attackers are typically self-radicalized with no direct connection to an organized terrorist group. With minimal training and coordination, they can carry out a mass shooting, detonate explosives, or drive a vehicle into a crowd of civilians. These attacks are frequently self-funded at amounts often considered too small to detect solely through the tracking of financial transactions. But studies show there is almost always some identifiable behavior leading up to a lone wolf attack, whether it be an online manifesto, training, reconnaissance, or the acquisition of weapons or other materials. Knowing this, we must continue exploring ways to identify these behaviors before an attack takes place. First, we should take a hard look at whether we can better utilize our existing prosecution tools and financial reporting framework. The Bank Secrecy Act criminalizes the act of money structuring, or making transactions under $10,000 to cause a bank to fail to report that transaction to the federal government. Structuring prosecutions and the use of asset forfeitures have come under criticism in recent years, due to cases where the funds of law-abiding citizens were seized and they were left fighting for their money back. As a result, both the IRS and the Department of Justice have taken the position they will focus only on structuring cases that involve significant criminal activity. The problem with this approach is that it focuses only on where the money originates, not on where the money is going. If a person is making multiple withdrawals of just under $10,000 within days, or withdrawals from multiple bank branches or multiple ATMs on the same day, for example, they are probably trying to hide what they plan to do with that money. We should also examine how we utilize suspicious activity reports prepared by banks and other financial institutions. We need to explore better technology to flag small transactions that may be indicative of illicit use, such as artificial intelligence systems designed to detect suspicious activity in real time. At the same time, we need to make sure that joint federal and local SAR review teams have the personnel and funding they require to get through and follow up on the tremendous volume of reports they receive each year. The suspicious activity reporting process is seriously impeded if the reports are not actually reviewed and acted on. Second, we need to look at ways that would-be attackers anonymously solicit, move, and spend money. If we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we would focus primarily on hawalas, cash couriers, and charities. Now, new payment methods such as virtual currencies, crowdfunding technologies, mobile payment applications, and online peer-to-peer payment systems provide persons with ever-expanding methods to raise and move funds anonymously. As these technologies develop, we must ensure that our reporting requirements keep pace. Another emerging issue is the proliferation of prepaid cards. Today, anyone can go into a supermarket and buy packages of prepaid cards in cash, which can be used to purchase virtually anything. You don't even need the physical card to make a purchase. Individuals can cut and paste the account number, expiration date, and security code into an email or text message and effectively transfer that purchasing power anywhere in the world. By doing so, they effectively convert their cash to a form of anonymous buying power, significantly working around the financial reporting safeguards that apply to traditional credit and debit cards. Finally, we should consider other methods to address this issue. There have been proposals to regulate various types of consumer products commonly used in attacks, such as ammonium nitrate. Tagging agents currently required for plastic explosives could be required for use in gunpowder, in bullets, and fireworks to help trace those products after an attack. Data on the purchases of items such as pressure cookers, diesel fuel, and other products could also be collected and tracked. At the same time, we must continue aggressive surveillance and infiltration of websites and social media used to spread propaganda, raise funds, and incite violence. And operators such as Facebook and Twitter must be pressed to enforce their terms of service and close accounts that are used to incite illegal activity. Just as we strive to cut off terrorist organizations from financial systems, we must also make it as difficult as possible for them to use the internet to finance and coordinate attacks. Finally, many lone wolf attackers at some point demonstrate indicia of depression, paranoia, or violence prior to an attack. In most communities, the only option for reporting someone is to call the police or the FBI. If there was a mechanism for some sort of mental health intervention, concerned friends and family members may be more willing to get that individual the help they need before they go down the path for violence. I fully acknowledge that each of these options comes with costs, both to taxpayers and consumers and to individual privacy. And these costs must be weighed against the likelihood these activities would in fact be effective, either as prevention and disruption or for criminal prosecution after the fact. Addressing the threat of lone wolf and small-scale terrorist attacks presents many challenges, and I applaud this subcommittee for taking on this difficult issue and opening up this bipartisan dialogue, and I stand ready to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The chair would now recognize Mr. Hughes?
Thank you. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee, it is a privilege to be invited to speak on the threat of extremist financing in the United States. Extremism inspired by jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS remains a potent threat to the U.S. Since 2014, 133 individuals have been charged with ISIS-related activities in the U.S. The vast majority of these individuals are U.S. citizens, speaking of a threat of homegrown terrorism. While violent plots often garner the most attention, a broad swath of cases demonstrate the enduring relevance of finance-related activities by jihadists in the West. This testimony concerns ISIS-related extremism, but there's other extremist organizations that pose a threat to national security. Recently, the FBI and DHS issued a joint intelligence bulletin stating that actors of the white supremacist extremist movement will likely continue to pose a threat of lethal violence within the next year. Despite these concerns, few studies to date unpack the financing of domestic extremism groups. There are significant differences between financing schemes utilized by domestic extremists and their jihadist counterparts. Funding of a designated terrorist organization is a criminal offense under the Material Support Statute, whereas there is no statutory designation for domestic extremist groups. The result is domestic extremist groups are not under the same pressure to disguise their funding as foreign terrorist organizations. However, I will focus primarily on my testimony on ISIS. The activity of ISIS adherents in the U.S. ranges from individuals using cryptocurrencies online to coordinated clusters supporting actors abroad. Impactful terrorist attacks do not require large sums of money, but rather low-level costs such as plane tickets, guns, or rental cars. In this way, participation in terrorist organizations is easier than it has been before. For counterterrorism practitioners, detecting suspicious financial transactions is difficult. Modern terrorist financing entails a range of behaviors that disguise illicit activity or circumvent detection altogether. A brief review of the ISIS in America cases highlights the diversity of the modern-day terrorist financing. In one type of scheme, individuals or groups of individuals crowdsource monies for foreign fighters who were already in ISIS-controlled territory. One illuminating example is a case of a husband and wife team in Missouri who raised money from the Bosnian diaspora and then gave that money to a high-ranking Bosnian-American ISIS commander. Another type of financing where individuals or groups garner resources to fund someone to travel overseas. This form of activity was especially common when traveling to ISIS was easier. Matt mentioned the case of a young man from Brooklyn who was financing 2 people to go join ISIS. In Minnesota, we had 3 men who were using fraudulent financial student loans to fund their travels. However, in the case of the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, the attacker allegedly used legal financial loans to acquire the money necessary to purchase weapons. And sometimes it's a back and forth. Sometimes ISIS is the instigator for funding. A good case of that is Mohammed Jalla in Virginia or Aaron Daniels in Ohio, who were giving money to al-Sudani, an external ISIS commander, to fund his attacks. One of the most striking cases of ISIS-related financing in the U.S. is that of Mohammed el-Shanawi. El-Shanawi was working with an ISIS commander in Syria. That commander gave him money through a series of UK shell companies and then funded the money through Maryland so he could get enough funding to attack the U.S. All told, he got about $8,700 before he was arrested. The review of the cases reveals 4 broader trends in the terrorist financing and counter-financing programs. First, government regulations is not the only approach to deter extremists. A public-private partnership of best practices can sometimes augment a government-led approach. Second, countering violent extremism programs should target violent extremists of various ideological shades, not just the Omar Mateen's of the world, but also the Dylan Roofs. Third, financing has largely become decentralized, as illustrated by the Maryland case. Terrorists now have a multitude of online platforms to exchange funds. Additionally, relatively small transactions are unlikely to draw attention, allowing terrorist finances to hide in plain sight. Lastly, initiatives aimed at detecting and disrupting finance-related activities should account for emerging technologies, whether it's violent extremists that mark their transfers in cryptocurrencies or hide their funds in plain sight. Committed terrorist actors are clearly willing to take the road less traveled to advance their aims. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair now recognize Mr. Reynolds. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce, Vice Chairman Pittenger, Ranking Member Perlmutter. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you here today to discuss how the financial sector and law enforcement can work together to combat lone wolf terrorist attacks. Over my career, I witnessed the critical role that financial institutions play in the detection and prevention of money laundering and terrorism financing. Without their assistance, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for law enforcement to follow the money. Recently, we have witnessed the rise of lone wolf terrorist attacks. Because these attacks are often inspired by, but unconnected to, larger terrorist groups, the techniques that we typically employ to track such terrorists are at times ill-suited to this new threat. When looking to identify the financial indicators of lone wolf attacks, the challenge for financial institutions is threefold. First, lone wolf attacks are characterized by low-dollar financial transactions. This makes our traditional detection and reporting tools less effective. Second, lone wolves don't exhibit typical terrorist financing behavior, frequently using their own clean money for the attack. Or said differently, their financial behavior blends with the myriad legitimate transactions conducted every day by law-abiding customers. Third, financial institutions are currently limited by domestic laws in their ability to share information between institutions or even across borders within the same institution. This can result in financial institutions being unable to identify abnormal client behavior. Given these challenges, how do financial institutions differentiate between normal customer activity and a customer planning a lone wolf attack? Often, a single piece of information, an account number, an IP address, or even a telephone number becomes the Rosetta Stone that allows financial institutions to correctly identify a nefarious actor engaging in what might be otherwise innocuous conduct. While not a silver bullet, continuing to receive these Rosetta Stones from law enforcement and modernizing the current sharing system is critical to the detection and prevention of future attacks. A few areas where information sharing could be improved include authorizing U.S. financial institutions to share SARs with foreign branches and affiliates, explicitly expanding the types of information sharing permitted under the Section 314B Safe Harbor, deprioritizing the investigation and reporting of low-value activity, and allowing financial institutions to reallocate these resources to higher-value intelligence activities, encouraging the formation of a U.S. Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, and clarifying financial institutions' ability to discuss the filing of SARs when working together on a case, and encouraging them to jointly file a SAR. I'd like to take a moment to illustrate the power of information sharing by discussing an investigation that Barclays conducted after law enforcement alerted us to an IP address that it believed was connected to a terrorism suspect. Using this IP address, Barclays identified Mr. A, who was a student. Mr. A received money from a variety of sources, including over £522,000 from Mr. C, 10,000 British pounds from Mr. J, and 4,000 pounds from Mr. C. Through further network analysis, we identified that Mr. C was part of a broader funding mechanism for potential terrorist activities. Additionally, we found that in addition to funding Mr. A, Mr. J also funded Mr. M, who Barclays had previously tracked and reported as a potential foreign terrorist fighter. And Mr. H and Mr. B, who Mr. A also funded, both had characteristics of foreign terrorist fighters. Perhaps most interestingly, we determined that Mr. A transferred money to a heavy machinery company that makes oil field replacement parts. From one IP address, we were able to identify related individuals who may have funded multiple foreign terrorist fighters, purchased oil field parts, and had links to others who were also funding or supporting suspected terrorist activities. While not every IP address will yield such potentially significant results, this case illustrates the power of the public-private partnership. Before I close, I would be remiss if I did not address the very real issue of customer privacy. Barclays takes our customers' privacy interests seriously, and rather than cast an impossibly wide net that includes data from millions of innocent customers, targeted information sharing allows us to focus on the few high-value cases where true national security risks are present. Moreover, by increasing our understanding of these transactions, it will allow us to discount alerts that would otherwise turn into SARs because we cannot understand the purpose of the transaction. So while at first it seems counterintuitive, robust information sharing actually enhances individual privacy, though admittedly not for the lone wolf terrorist. Financial institutions want to get this right. We are committed to ensuring that terrorists do not use our institutions to fund their activities, but we cannot do it alone. We need to be able to share and receive information both from law enforcement and between financial institutions to be most effective in identifying terrorist financing. I'd like to once again thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak on this important topic as well as for its continued engagement on this important national security issue. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, each one of you, for your presentation today. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Reynolds, you appropriately at the end of your presentation talk about the need for privacy concerns, especially with people who are uninvolved. How do you see that playing out in our attempts to detect and deter? So tell me a little bit more about that.
I think it's a great question, Mr. Chair, and I think that in many ways we have to balance, obviously, customer privacy and some of the new technology that we have to exploit data. One of the reasons why I'm a great supporter of increased information sharing is because I think it allows financial institutions, first and foremost, to target particular individuals or particular cells or groups and to do network analysis that's of great benefit to law enforcement. So again, rather than casting a very broad net, it allows us to really focus on the individuals who are of most concern to law enforcement, which in my view helps protect customer privacy. Secondly, especially in the United States, very often because of the way the rules are structured, where an institution cannot discern really from what's in front of it the lawful or commercially reasonable purpose for the transaction, very often by default you have to file a SAR. So in my view, very often institutions have to file SARs on cases where if they had additional information on that particular customer, that particular transaction, they very well might not file that SAR. So I do think it both enhances our ability to focus on those suspects that present the greatest national security issues, but also allows us not to file on customers who I think with just a little more information we could probably understand the point of the transaction, and therefore we wouldn't need to file a SAR.
On page 3, Mr. Reynolds, in your testimony, you talk about the need for financial institutions to be able to receive and share information. In your opinion, is that sharing going on at currently, or do we need a change in law, change in regulations? And if the sharing is ongoing, you just think that it's not enough, or give me a little bit more flesh there if you can.
Sure. So it currently is going on, and I think that I would have to say that I think our law enforcement partners are working very hard, most especially the FBI, at sharing information. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. I do think there's a great amount of sharing that goes on. I think, though, that really we could do more, and I think if we had more targeted sharing, we would do better. On Section 314B, I think that's where we probably do need either regulatory or a legislative fix. Currently, under the regulations and law, institutions can only share where there is a suspicion of money laundering or terrorism financing. So what that essentially means is once you've already detected something to which you've decided it's suspicious, that's the point when you're really allowed to share. Really, in my view, we need to back that up because some of the benefit to sharing is actually detecting the activity in the first place. I think if you look at lone wolf terrorism, like we're looking at here today, this is a great example where if we moved that sharing line back and institutions were allowed to share at an earlier stage, I think we would have a greater ability to both understand transactions, so exclude innocent suspects, but also focus on those suspects who present the greatest risk.
Dr. Levitt, if you could, I would like your opinion on the privacy issue also, and how we are balancing that and what your long-term concerns would be. Because typically, in my opinion, we establish a protocol and then we try to work up to the edge of the protocol, and sometimes we might go over that. And so I'd like your insights if you could.
I agree completely with Mr. Reynolds that we have to take the privacy concerns into account in the very first moment and balance these equally important concerns. I also think that if we provide more information, we could have better SARs, better SARs filing. It was my experience, excuse me, at Treasury, that we would sometimes find ourselves, swimming in a sea of unnecessary SARs, and that takes time to go through those. So even from the law enforcement side, from the government side, this has got great utility. It's difficult, though, because if we do expand the ability, for example, under Section 314B, if we move the needle earlier in the process as the baseline, so you're going to be opening up more accounts to potential investigation on the potentially negative side. The potential positive side is that you'll be in a better position to rule out the people that you don't really need to be looking at. But you could be looking at a larger number of accounts in the first instance. And so I think we need to be clear about what it is we're concerned about with privacy. I think the biggest thing is how that information is handled. What's the purpose of looking, how you look, what's done with that information, as opposed to, in that first instance, how strong is the baseline for the look? Because I agree, right now, the baseline is such that if you don't already have a money laundering or terror financing concern, you can't look. And for the purpose of lone offenders or lone wolves, that's a little bit too late.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes for questions.
So I want to follow similar line. Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Hughes, you talked about public-private partnerships. And Mr. Reynolds, you gave us the example of Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C, Mr. D, Mr. H, and J. But it was all came off of one IP address that was delivered to you. So explain to me, are you expecting something from law enforcement to help you focus? Because basically this was coming from probably, and I think Mr. Hughes, you talked about it, some social media statement or something that tipped off law enforcement to help you focus. So is that what you're expecting from the FBI or somebody?
I think that's absolutely right, Congressman. In this case, it was an IP address that was given to us, and what we found is while the bank, and I think I won't speak for every bank, but I think most banks have strong programs and work very hard to detect these on their own. What we have found is that where we're given that piece of information, whether it's an IP address or a phone number or a name or an account number, very often it's that initial thread that we're able to pull that really allows us to do some very, very exciting network analysis and allows us to really build out the network. Because again, when you're talking about lone wolf terrorists, very often their activity looks very much like a normal consumer. And
would it have made any difference in your example? You said that one of the donors was for 522,000 pounds. I mean, if it were a smaller amount, would you have not been tipped off?
No, I think actually we would have still found that the 522,000, to be clear, was not one transfer. It was multiple transfers over time. So what we did is we essentially started from Mr. A, who was the initial person we detected using that IP address, and then started to build out using other factors and looked and really built the network out from Mr. A and then found a lot of the actors. And then it jumped to, as you can see in the chart, there's various parts of the chart. It's quite large. In fact, we sort of condensed some of it to make it fit on one page. But at the end of the day, we found actually multiple groups that were all in concert and acting together. We saw links between them, whether it be addresses or transfers. And so what we were able to do to this was the UK government who had given us this information. We were able to then turn back to the UK government and give them a chart. And again, we obviously don't have visibility into exactly what these individuals were doing other than their financial footprint, but we were able to give the UK government a very clear picture of what, at least to us, looked like a financing network. And it really came from that one IP address.
Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, you're just looking, law enforcement is going to give you a thread, and you want to pull it to see how big the sweater is, right? And so you're looking for law enforcement to give you something that's going to give you leads. I would note, though, when you look at the actual homegrown terrorism attacks, the successful attacks, the overwhelming vast majority were already on the FBI's radar prior to attack. So it's not necessarily the lack of information, it's the lack of the ability to act, and sometimes people haven't crossed the legal threshold, sometimes the FBI doesn't have the resources to run things down, and so I think that's where the public-private partnership comes into, right? So going to Barclays and saying, I have this, I know there's something there, you have some resources there, can you help me pull this thread a little bit more? I think that's where we play a role.
All right, Mr. Marino, I want to switch to domestic terrorism for a second, because you talked about that and the difference between the laws available for detecting a foreign kind of financial assistance versus domestic. And I'm thinking of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blowing up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. So I don't know how much that ammonium nitrate or whatever it was he packed into that truck cost him. I mean, maybe you guys have some estimate. But how, you know, I'm worried about those guys too. How would you best say we can stop that murderous act?
Yes, sir. Well, I think that the approach for domestic attacks is a bit different. I know there's been talk about potentially criminalizing or creating a proper federal crime for domestic terrorism versus just what we have now is basically application of state and federal law. As far as the ammonium nitrate from the Oklahoma City bombing, so we've had a DHS proposed rule for about 10 years now. The fact is that we just haven't seen a lot of further explosives attacks with ammonium nitrate use. So I think in each one of these cases, we really have to balance the cost to the government, the cost to the consumer, and the cost to people's privacy. If people want to be tracked, and are we going to be running down every time someone goes to Home Depot and buys fertilizer versus a significant purchase in an attack like that? So I think in each case we have to take kind of lessons learned from the attack and figure out how much we're willing to invade the privacy of consumers versus the potential for the use of that same sort of material in a future attack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair would now recognize the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. Mr. Reynolds, from your experience at FinCEN, how many SARS reports were filed each year?
It's a very significant number. I don't know the current total, but I know that the database currently holds about 2 million records that is largely comprised of SARS and CTRs.
Yes, sir. This is from financial institutions here in the United States.
Yes, sir.
Can you say to what extent or range your experience at B of A and at Barclays, how many reports that you would have to file each year?
From Barclays, it's probably in the several thousand. For Bank of America, it's well over 100,000 a year.
Yes, sir. And from your testimony, what you have said, that if you had the legal capacity to receive information from the federal government in terms of particular IDs and individuals that they're pursuing, that would then reduce in vast amount the number of individuals that you're having to send reports on and give oversight to. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that.
Yes, sir. So let's look at sharing data between institutions and your own and other institutions. While there has been latitude there, is there a restriction or an inhibition to do that in reference to legal concerns? Is there a need for a safe harbor for institutions to make sure that they can do this? Is there a gray area there that we need to clarify?
There is. Under current regulation, the way it reads right now is that you have to have a suspicion of money laundering or terrorism financing. So as one of my fellow panelists pointed out, at that point it really is too late, because at
Very
that point—
Very subjective in some respects.
It's already happened. It is. It's much too late. And I think the real benefit of the sharing, whether it's from the government or whether it's under the safe harbor between institutions, really comes where institutions can leverage the power of the data analytics that they have now, and they can look across the data. And I think to your point, which I think is exactly the correct one, is that it both allows us to target those people who are suspicious, because you can see multiple sides of the transaction as opposed to just the side that Barclays or just the side that Bank of America sees. You can see all different sides of the transaction, so it allows you to better target those individuals you really care about. But likewise, by being able to see all sides of the transaction, you actually are able to discount a great number of these SARs that we would otherwise file just simply because we lack information to discount the suspicion, which really is the standard, is that if you can't discount the suspicion, you have to file. And so in many cases, I think we file where if we knew a little more, we probably wouldn't have to.
Yes, sir. I think it's well said. You know, it's so important for us right now to pull back and take a full view of assessing this and come up with a different basis for how we can pursue these individuals. And I think all of us who cherish our privacies and civil liberties, we would respect the type of engagement that you've proposed today.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Mr. Hughes, I would like to ask you, reference to those who provide material support to lone wolf terrorists, are we doing enough to punish them, or is there any gaps in our law enforcement that Congress could address?
In regards to material support, I don't believe so, because material support clause is actually quite elastic and broad-based. So unlike other countries, if you're driving to the airport to go jump on a plane to go to Syria, you get arrested for the drive. And so the material support clause, right or wrong, gives law enforcement a large latitude to do that. We've also seen law enforcement be pretty creative on the way they do arrest for individuals they may be concerned about that doesn't rise to a level. So a good case is California. 2 young men got arrested for 26 charges of bank fraud. They were clearly ISIS supporters through and through, but there wasn't enough to rise to a material support case. So I think you're seeing law enforcement in many ways aren't allowing the system to light up in a way they used to, because they're concerned about these lone wolf attacks. The gentleman who stabbed 10 people in Minnesota, right? And so they're not letting people talk to other people, and they're closing in earlier on, and so they're more willing to use forward-leaning prosecutions.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Mr. Levitt. To what extent are foreign governments involved, in your opinion, in helping fund bad actors affiliated with otherwise associated known as terrorist organizations?
Well, state sponsorship is still a very major problem. That's a separate problem from the lone wolf or lone offender problems yet. To the contrary, we have lots of good partners around the world. As you heard before, the Barclays case involves the UK, where people are trying to work together with us to deal with foreign terrorist travelers in particular. But there still are plenty of countries out there, the Irans of the world, et cetera, that pose significant problems. But I would argue that's a separate problem set.
Is Qatar a concern to you?
I had the opportunity to testify in Qatar recently, and yes, Qatar is a concern. It's also not the only concern in the region, and some of the issues that have been raised about Qatar are very substantive, and some of them are not. So it's a complicated issue. It doesn't fit into a black or white, but there's more that Qatar could do, as there is more that others in the region could do.
Thank you,
The gentleman's
sir.
time has expired. The chair would now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the lady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the years since 9/11, our nation has witnessed a share of attacks by homegrown violent extremists inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. This includes the San Bernardino shooters who tragically took the lives of 14 and wounded 21 others, as well as Pulse nightclub shooter who callously took the lives of 49 and wounded another 53 innocent victims. However, as the recent events in Charlottesville, which took the life of Heather Hare and 2 VA state troopers, have reminded us, extremists radicalized by foreign terrorist groups are not the only terrorists with the capacity and will to target and kill American citizens. Indeed, domestic terrorist attacks have become more frequent in recent years. I just took a look at what has happened since 1992. Ruby Ridge standoff, 3 killed, 2 wounded. Oklahoma City bombing, 168 killed, over 680 wounded. 2009 United States Holocaust Memorial Museum shooting, 1 killed, 1 wounded. 2012 Wisconsin Sikh Temple shooting, killed 6, wounded 4. 2013 Los Angeles International Airport shooting, attack on TSA officer, killed 1, wounded 6. 2015 Planned Parenthood shooting, killed 3, wounded 9. 2017 Portland train attack, killed 2, wounded 1. Charlottesville car ramming attack, killed 3, wounded 19. And I'm worried about these domestic attacks. As a matter of fact, I was forced to focus on it a little bit more yesterday in my office in Los Angeles. One of the people opening the mail opened an envelope and a bunch of powder fell out with a note about me dying and killing Hillary Clinton, and on and on and on. This is getting more frequent, and I know that we have privacy concerns and information sharing and all of that, but I'm wondering, what can we do to get a handle, a fix on these lone killers? And not simply just say we throw our hands up and we can't really do anything because of privacy concerns. And I'm wondering, particularly at financial institutions and banks, et cetera, if questionnaires that does not invade privacy, but simply ask questions about what the intentions are for the use of certain money under certain circumstances. And those people can say whatever they want to, and they can respond in whatever way they want to. But if resources are used to go out and commit killings, et cetera, they will have lied on the questionnaire, and perhaps that can trigger some kind of actions to begin to prevent this kind of domestic terrorism. I think we should focus a lot on domestic terrorism also. So I would like to ask again, given all that you have said about how difficult it is and the privacy concerns, do you have any thoughts about what we can do to begin to deal with the KKK and the white nationalists, the extremists, the alt-right? They're on the internet, Brett Bart. If you look at the YouTube, you see how much they want to kill me and others. What can we do? Anybody, any one of you?
Sure, I think there's a couple things to unpack there. First is, I absolutely agree, it's not an either-or proposition, right? You should be worried about the Omar Mateens, the Orlando shooters of the world as much as you are the James Fields and the Dylan Roofs of the world. And I'm concerned when we look at these issues that we tend to bifurcate it and make it into buckets. There are different programs that we could address in these things. Domestic extremists tend to use criminal activities in order to fund their attacks, and in a way that jihadists don't. So they're usually more likely to pop on the radar on these things. There's a number of different organizations that are doing interventions and spaces on far-right and domestic extremism groups like Life After Hate out of Chicago.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to interrupt. I have to yield to Mr. Goppenheimer. He has to go. Please, I yield.
Thank you very much. I want to recognize the program on extremism for bringing light to the recent report that a senior ISIS official used eBay and PayPal to funnel money to a terrorist in the United States. Today, I'm writing to FinCEN to urge them to take additional steps to curb money laundering and suspicious financial transactions online. As technology advances and lone wolf terrorists continue to innovate, how can federal enforcement efforts keep pace to crack down on the illicit use of new transaction methods? And I'm open to anyone responding. Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member.
I'll just say in brief, because no one else is lighting up, that's actually a success case, right? I mean, that gentleman was stopped. That means of transfer, as sophisticated as it was identified. I would not cite that as a case of, oh my God, we need to do more. I'd cite that as a case of, they're trying to get sophisticated. We're pretty sophisticated too. We were on top of that. We thwarted that case. But your overall point is absolutely on target, and that's the whole purpose of this hearing, I think, is to figure out how we can fine-tune our tools in those cases which are the exception that prove the rule, which is to say that truly they are lone wolves, where they're using their own money or they're taking out a loan legitimately or doing some type of crime that might not come on our radar. These are the cases that are really different. For the vast majority of other things, we have pretty good systems in place. They can be fine-tuned in various ways to facilitate better sharing within the financial community between government and financial services. We've been talking a lot about government providing information to banks. That's very important. We also need to talk about the information that banks see so they can provide, usable SARs to investigators. But what's different here is what do we do about those cases where someone's taking $50, a knife out of the drawer, $2,000? And the answer is we're going to have to couple this toolkit with a whole bunch of others, including old school human and basic investigations, because this is not going to solve all our problems. There will be cases where finance is not going to be the biggest part of our toolkit. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair would now recognize Mr. Rothfuss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Levitt, I want to start with you. Mr. Reynolds had talked about a case where law enforcement came to Barclays, I think, with an IP address, and so that the investigation was able to go forward on that basis. Can you think of any information not currently available to law enforcement that might allow authorities to identify lone wolves if financial institutions started gathering that information? Again, the case that Mr. Reynolds cited, it was the law enforcement that came with the IP address to the financial institutions. But can you think of other information a financial institution might be gathering that would help in a detection?
So in advance of this hearing, I gave this a lot of thought, and the simple answer is I don't yet have a great answer, because most of the activity, as you've heard my panelists say, that we're talking about in a true lone wolf situation is going to look completely innocent, with the exception of someone who engages in crime or misfiles or lies on a loan application, where we might find out about them for other purposes. But someone who just takes out money from their bank account or gets a job for a couple of months or asks mom or dad or a sister or whatever for funds, that's going to be very, very hard to track. The only thing I can think of is this. We need to take a close look at the very granular, detailed information that we collect, the type of thing that makes the analysts really excited. right? The email address, the phone number, the driver's license number, more recently the IP address. Are there other types of things that we could be collecting that would actually be useful, not collecting for collection's sake? I think a lot of people were really surprised at how incredibly powerful the IP address could be as a tool, and especially at a time when people might be lone wolves but will still say something on social media.
Mr. Moreno, you identified a number of types of financial services that the lone wolves utilize. I think you mentioned the prepaid cards and other things. Is there a favored type of financial services that lone wolves use?
Sir, I don't know if there's any one favored method, but there's certainly there's certainly a buffet of options that are now, at the disposal of folks that weren't there even 5 years ago. And I think really the point is, if people think they can move money, solicit money, raise money in a near anonymous fashion, then they will try to do so. And so
Might it not lose some anonymity, though? The case you cited, I think, where you could take the payment card information and send it via text. I guess you have a throwaway phone, you can maintain anonymity there. But it would put some fingerprints on it, wouldn't it?
It would, sir, yes. But I think there are additional steps. So, for example, for prepaid cards, we can put limits on how and what can be purchased with those types of prepaid cards. People can buy packs of 4 or 8 or 12 of them and put together a few $100s. Well, if we said that you can only use those types of cards in certain retail storefront locations and not online, or if you could not aggregate them and buy expensive items, or if you needed a physical card and perhaps a chip with it, I think there are some reforms that we can do to sort of plug those gaps, and I think we can look at those types of plugging actions in all varieties of these new kinds of emerging ways. But I think really the key is to shine light on who is using this, both as a deterrent, so that people don't think they can get away with these sorts of transactions anonymously, but also as a way to prevent and prosecute after the fact.
Mr. Reynolds, if we talked a little bit about that suspicious standard in 314B. Can you give some examples of activities that might be detected by earlier information sharing, if not for that standard in there?
Sure. Let me give an example that we've seen in other cases. I saw this when I was on the government side, but I think would be equally applicable to terrorist financing. You may have a person who, for instance, would have a bank account at Bank A, and there's money going in and out of the account, nothing terribly suspicious. And so if you just look at that, it's a person who works at a sort of mid-level job, pay coming in looks commensurate with the job, so there's no reason to look at that account again. If I then told you that in addition to having an account at Bank A, this person had an account at Bank B, C, D, E, and F, and we saw money coming into all of those accounts as well, suddenly that person is incredibly suspicious. But this would be exactly the sort of information that you could not share currently.
Would there be a limiting principle, though, for a financial institution as it does this kind of information sharing, if it's not reasonable, or if it's not a suspicion standard?
So again, I think in the law, the definition of suspicious obviously is very technical in the law. And what I would argue is certainly to the extent that you don't have a need to look at a customer, then I don't think you should be looking at that customer. And certainly, in my experience, that has been the rule that everyone lives by. What I would say is that I think that there's some opportunities. If you're using larger data sets, you don't actually have people looking at that data. So the data itself is sitting there, but it's not something that people are going through. No one's looking at it. No one's saying, oh, I saw that Mr. Reynolds likes to buy comic books, and so he spent $500. There's no one actually looking at that. What it is instead is it's algorithms that are running across the data, and one of your algorithms may, for instance, be, look for an individual who has these certain financial parameters and has 5 or more accounts across institutions. Now, there may be a very good reason that person does, and it could be quickly discounted by an analyst. But I would suggest that's the sort of thing that you would want an actual human being to then look at and determine, okay, this looks out of character for this person. This is not what we would expect for this particular customer, so let's look a little closer and understand why do they not look like everyone else. And I think that's the fundamental point that we're talking about is that thread, whether it's provided by the government or provided by big data, that thread to pull on.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair would now recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member. I want to thank the witnesses for your help as well. Some of you are frequent flyers to this subcommittee, so really appreciate it. With respect to lone wolf and individual actor events, I worry that we're not using the right tools. You know, there's that old saying, when the only tool on your tool belt is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And so we have a fairly robust financial services community that's highly regulated. We have the Patriot Act, so we have those tools that we can use to try to track organizations and how they're funding terrorism. I'm not so sure that that's applicable with individual actors, though. I can say that the cases that I've been most familiar with, the marathon bombings and a couple other lone wolf, so-called, attacks that have come before the committee, it was really behavioral abnormalities that that really presented themselves. And in looking back, those were the things that sort of would have raised the red flags. Well, there was one case where a gentleman purchased a large knife, but even that was fairly, in retrospect, it looked serious, but when it happened, it probably wasn't. Mr. Hughes, you appeared before the subcommittee when we talked about de-radicalization, and some of those approaches, better communications with our folks in the Muslim community, mosques. We had a couple of cases where the imams said, an individual was, acting out and was a security concern, even within the mosque. Those type of reporting events are probably, in my mind, more applicable to the individual cases than trying to look at somebody's bank account and figure out what they're doing there. Is there? I mean, are you of the mind that doing this, from a financial standpoint, is the best way to get at these individual actors and so-called lone wolf terrorists? Anybody?
Let me jump in, and then maybe my colleagues can join too. I tend to believe that the financial reviews are probably going to be later on in the investigation. And so the case that you mentioned, the young man in Massachusetts with a large knife, he was also talking to Junaid Hussain in Raqqa. So that's your red flag for you, right? And so the issue becomes he hadn't crossed a legal threshold. So he was a full investigation, but not enough to arrest. And so there's not a safety net to kind of veer these folks towards disengagement, de-radicalization, the stuff that Mr. Morano talked about. There's no ability for the mosque in Boston to send those two folks to somewhere else. And until we figure that out, that's actually the gaping hole. Because if you talk to the FBI, they're saying, I don't have enough men and women to sit and run 8-hour shifts outside of a kid's house until they turn 18. Right. I need to have different tools, because I really want to focus on the guy that I'm really worried about in Indiana, but I can't because I know this guy in Boston is also concerning. So we have to provide some non-law enforcement off-ramps to both law enforcement but also communities to build those partnerships. And you're absolutely right. In about 60 to 70% of the cases, depending on how you look at the studies, there is a bystander effect. People see something's concerning but don't know what to do with it, right? And so they're watching this train wreck happen in slow motion. And we as a federal government and we as a community partners have not provided any kind of tools and responsibilities to folks to deal with this.
Anybody else? Mr. Levitt? Dr. Levitt, I'm sorry.
That's fine. The only one who cares about the doctor is my mother. And well, maybe she is watching. Thank you.
Well, that's important then.
She is. From Massachusetts, she cares.
Oh, there you go.
Look, the first thing to say is that these are not mutually exclusive, right? The question isn't, do we do financial lines of inquiry, or do we work with communities to try and off-ramp people who can be off-ramped and do other things for people who can't, but work with communities who are there on the ground and have that great, of course we do all these different things. And in different cases, different tools will be applicable. I think what we're going to find is that in the case of lone, or because of this bystander effect, maybe a little bit more known wolves, what we're going to find is that Financial information or intelligence is not going to be the panacea, but it'll be a piece. It'll plug a hole of something, and it'll help make a link. It'll help contribute to a link chart. And while we love for all of this to be as preemptive as possible, sometimes it won't be.
Right.
But the financial piece will almost always be really important in the post-blast what happened. So if you look back, I was the government's expert witness in the Boston Marathon case. There's a financial piece there too, and that's always very important too. So it's not a question of either or. It's just leveraging all of them, and that's why I keep saying there's going to be a financial role in all this, and there's more we can do. But at the end of the day, the true lone offender, whether from a foreign ideology or a domestic ideology, and those are both terrorists and need to be dealt with, we have to use our entire toolkit. And money is not always going to be the strongest tool for some guy who's just taking a couple $100s out of his or her bank account.
Hey, gentlemen's time
Thank you.
has
And I yield
expired.
back. I thank the chairman.
Gentlemen's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And complex issue. You know, when we're talking about trying to be able to track somebody that wants to be able to buy a knife to ammonium nitrate, how to be able to draw those together, $50 purchase versus $1,500 worth of purchase, to be able to navigate that and to be able to identify them. Mr. Levitt, when you were making your opening statement, said something that I thought was interesting, that the private sector has a lot of information if we give them greater insight. And I think you were just alluding to some of that, but what greater insight can we give to the private sector? What are going to be the triggers to be able to notify authorities of what to be able to look for? And to a degree, something that we haven't hit an awful lot on, how do we still protect some of those privacy concerns?
So the government is constantly looking at other information that's not available to the public and identifying trends. Some of those trends could be very useful, some of them will be less useful. Sometimes the government won't know what trend is useful until it speaks to the private sector, the people who are expert in banking and finance, and see that they can add something to the conversation and demonstrate that, well, it's significant in this type of activity but not in the other. If we are not having a really ongoing, regular and robust public-private dialogue where the government is saying, here are things we're really looking at, we're really interested in, and the private sector is saying, okay, great, here's what we need more from you to be able to give you more effective SARs, then we're missing an opportunity. I do think the UK, as some of my other panelists have pointed out, has a new and interesting model. It may not be perfect for us, but the National Crime Agency oversees this effort to have an ongoing discussion and dialogue. Part of that would have to be, as I think it was Mr. Reynolds who said, combined with an effort to enable banks to talk to one another and convince them that that's in their interest as well. But I do think we need to push in that direction, because at the end of the day, we're not talking about $1,500 or $50. We're talking about $50 or $4 or no dollars if you're taking something out of the kitchen drawer.
Thank you. And bring up an important point, Mr. Reynolds, maybe if you'd speak on this a little bit more. You'd stated that Barclays has maybe several thousand SARS reports. I think and Bank of America may have a couple 100,000. In terms of that communication between our financial institutions, is this proprietary? Is it something that is inhibiting that sort of conversation from going on? And also, would you maybe speak a little bit to knowing your customer in terms of maybe not making that SARS report simply because you know what that customer's business is like?
Sure, absolutely. So this actually is one of the restrictions that we labor under right now, is institutions can't discuss SARs amongst themselves. So for instance, if Barclays were to file a SAR on company A, and Bank of America had that same customer, we're actually not allowed under domestic law to discuss with Bank of America the fact that we filed a SAR, which is somewhat ironic because probably the single strongest factor to suggest that a customer may be suspicious is the fact that you filed a SAR. And that's actually the one thing you can't talk to your peer institutions about. So it becomes a very, very delicate discussion where not only can you not mention a SAR, but you can't discuss anything that would give an indication that you filed or did not file a SAR as to that customer. So these discussions are incredibly technical and very difficult to have. which makes it increasingly difficult, I think, to share. Even when you're jointly working on a case, under current guidance, you can't, for instance, let's say you've been working with Bank of America under 314B on a case. I can't say to Bank of America, you know, I really think this is suspicious, I'm going to file a SAR. That would be illegal. So that becomes very, very challenging to share information about that. In terms of know your customer, I think you're absolutely right. You know, my view is that the bank which owns that customer really has the best opportunity to know what that customer looks like, what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, and what looks suspicious. And so if I'm able to speak to another institution who owns that customer and has the KYC for that customer, they can very often explain to me very quickly why what looks suspicious to me is actually not suspicious at all. And so then I'm not wasting government time by filing a SAR, and I'm not wasting you know, quality analyst and investigator time further investigating that case. But likewise, by getting KYC information from another institution, I can better understand that customer, and I may actually determine that something that looks ordinary otherwise may actually be suspicious. So I absolutely agree with that. I think the sharing of KYC information to the extent we can under the safe harbor is a very effective way to understand those customers better and determine whether their behavior is suspicious or not.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Reynolds.
time has expired.
Yield back.
Chair would now recognize Ms. Loney for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman for recognizing him, and I thank the ranking member for holding this hearing on so-called lone wolf terrorist attacks. It's particularly important to me since I've had some in my district, and in fact one about 6 months ago in the Chelsea area where a homemade bomb went off. It didn't kill anyone, but it injured many. So my question is on terrorism financing. It appears, according to press reports and other reports I've read, the terrorists are moving away from the financial system because of the oversight of the banks, of the know your customer requirements, and are going to bitcoins. There have been several published reports that criminals used bitcoins to finance the sale or purchase of sex trafficking victims and other illegal activities and drugs and guns and other areas. And what is the penalty for using bitcoins in our financial system to finance criminal activity? Is there a sanction? Is there a fee? Is there penalty that's placed on someone who uses bitcoins for dangerous purposes? And actually, Mr. Perlmutter and the ranking chairman, we should look at bitcoins because they are escalating forward in our economy as a way of financing crime, really terrible crimes. But what is the penalty for using bitcoins? What is your knowledge of bitcoins in financing crimes?
I can start on that from the penalty perspective, ma'am. The penalty would be no different for using bitcoins as for using any other form of currency. So whether it's cash, wires, checks, prepaid cards, or Bitcoin, the penalties will all be the same. Bitcoin is considered a currency under U.S. law. So if you laundered money or funded terrorism with Bitcoin, the same penalties would be applicable as if you did it with U.S. dollars. I think the challenge is that Bitcoin obviously presents a greater ability to remain anonymous, which obviously a wire transfer, a traditional wire transfer would not. So I think that's the key difference between the two, but in terms of penalties, they would be the same.
Well, talking about being anonymous, in the district that I represent, many criminals don't use the banking system. They just purchase real estate because there's no questions asked. They have $100 million or $100,000, whatever. They go buy a piece of real estate, no questions asked. You sell it, you've got your money to do whatever you want. And a number of us have worked on legislation to bring in accounting for what we call beneficial ownership, that people should have to reveal the true beneficial ownership. And what is your feelings on that? Would that be a source of combating terrorism financing?
I'll start again. I'm a strong supporter of the legislation, so I'd strongly encourage passing it. I think it would be tremendously helpful both to law enforcement. Looking at my law enforcement background, I know it would have been tremendously useful to have it when I was a prosecutor. And looking at it from a financial institution's perspective, it would also be incredibly valuable for the work that we do.
And the CFIUS bill, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which looks at foreign investment from the lens of whether or not it is a threat to our national security. How do you feel that that law is operating? Do you think it needs to be strengthened? It is a tool to combat terrorism and financing and financial terrorism and other areas, the CFIUS bill.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it, that question for this hearing, because it seems to me it's a slightly different issue. I think of CFIUS, and I worked in CFIUS at one point in government. It's incredibly important, but traditionally, actually, it's something different than terrorism. There are sometimes terrorism pieces to it, but overall, it's about larger issues. And certainly in terms of the lone offender in the small scale, I don't know of any case that's come anywhere near the size of something that would be real estate purchases or CFIUS. That's a much larger, broader terror finance question.
And do you think you could just look at the transactions in a lone wolf in a bank and suspect this lone wolf did a pressure cooker, where he put everything in there and created a pressure cooker bomb? But purchasing these items would not put off any red lights, and so how can we get more red lights that would help us track these lone wolves?
There is some programs FBI runs InfraGard, which works with private companies to essentially set up tripwires to alert folks. So a good case, Najib Azazi buys a bunch of materials in Denver to build a bomb, and the local salon and beauty salon calls the FBI and says, I'm a little worried about this guy. And so the extent we can kind of build up those relationships and get that type of public-private partnership going a little bit more, I think it would be useful.
Thank you. My time is up.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony today. We appreciate it greatly. I'll get right into the questioning. Dr. Levitt, terrorist financing has shifted dramatically over the years due in large part to the increased use of social media we talked about. In your opinion, what do you think the future of terrorist financing lies? Where does it lie? And what measures can we take to combat it?
So in my experience, terror financing is a non-static issue. It is constantly changing. It's changing based on the actions we take to combat it and to restrict the environment in which illicit actors can finance their behaviors, and also based on what opportunities present themselves. And that means it's not always moving in one direction. When the Terror Finance Tracking Program was exposed several years ago, we saw that we worried that maybe some terrorists would stop using the formal banking sector. They still did, but they also went back old school and they used cash couriers. If you look at the UN Security Council's latest report on the Islamic State, they too have member states reporting that today, as the Islamic State is on its back heels, it's increasingly using cash couriers. And so we have to constantly assess and reassess to figure out which tools are going to be most effective. And I think that's part of the conversation that could then be had or be better had between the public and private sectors, not just what's the latest, sexiest thing, but where on that spectrum are things right now at any given time.
Good. Mr. Reynolds, from your experience in both the public and now the private sector, can you explain how the government can fully investigate and exploit these terrorist networks while ensuring that the American citizen's right to privacy is protected?
Yeah, I think the key to that, again, is to the extent that we coordinate between the public and the private sector. The way that I always viewed it in the government is that the public sector tends to have a very good horizontal view, but they don't always have very good tremendous depth on any particular customer or certainly to their finances, whereas financial institutions have very good depth, so they have very good vertical, but they lack the horizontal that the public sector has. I think that if in a very targeted way you can bring together the threats that the public sector has identified and bring those to the private sector can then work to expand out those networks and tell the public sector what it doesn't know. There were certainly cases that I was involved with over time where we may have thought we had the ringleader of a particular, whether it be terrorism financing or whether it be money laundering, but we thought we had the ringleader. We brought that to a financial institution who then came back to us and said, actually, you have a mid-level person. Here's this whole nother level to the organization that you didn't know about. But we were able to determine that they're all connected because, for example, they use the same device ID, which meant they use the same iPad or the same computer to access bank accounts. So I think that's just one example of where if you combine those two pieces of information, I think it both focuses the efforts. So again, we're not sort of trawling among millions of customers looking for bad people. We're really focused on the individuals and the information that we know credibly has some link to potentially bad activity. And it will allow us to then hopefully move resources away from the sort of lower value intelligence activities and really focus them on the higher value, which I think, in my view at least, enhances privacy.
Good, thank you. Mr. Marino, can you explain how law enforcement and intelligence agencies share information, and do you believe that the government is proficient in this task, or are there specific areas of improvement that you would recommend? What would they be?
Sir, I'm normally not a person to say throw money at a problem and that'll fix it, but as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that I think we have fantastic techniques, we have fantastic people, we have great statutes. However, additional resources in these areas would always be welcomed. So, for example, the SAR review process, I can say from my experience, financial institutions do a great job at investing in technology and issuing SARs. There are not always enough folks to review them. So when they are reviewed, it could be months afterward. So in terms of thorough review of SARs and rapid response to the suspicions that are arisen, we could always use more people. Joint terrorist task forces are a great way to integrate federal, state, and local law enforcement to share information, but they're also often short-staffed. So in this area, this is a place where I would say we have a lot of the right tools already. What we sometimes lack is the resources to implement them.
Okay. Mr. Reynolds, real quick, we got a small amount of time here. Is there another country that is surpassing the United States in their ability to target and neutralize terrorist financing?
I would not say surpassing, but I think the UK is equivalent to it, and I think the UK has some very exciting new programs and pilots that they're implementing that I would suggest the U.S. should look strongly at implementing as well.
Okay, thank you again. I yield my time back.
And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Just be advised, we've got votes coming up. We're going to try to get all the questions in before the votes.
Thanks to the panel for being here today. Mr. Marino, and I'm probably going to be too general, but as we talk about what ways we can address the changing threat landscape, if a terrorist can cause mass destruction casualties with just a few $1,000s, I think you would agree that we can't just lower the currency transaction report requirement. What in addition, and maybe you've covered this several times today, but can you succinctly give me what in addition to that could we do to see these? Is it the algorithms that we heard earlier that Mr. Reynolds was talking about? How are we going to get a hold of this thing?
Yes, sir. I don't think that changing the limits upward or downward is an easy fix. I think if anything, you might just get more reports, but not necessarily better reports. I think we can downscale what we do, I think, to try to better focus on transactions that are suspicious, even if they are at the 4-figure or possibly even 3-figure level. So I think
and again, putting in algorithms that identify specific characteristics of a transaction?
Yes, sir. I think that we should, there's always going to be a manual review process, but that should be coupled in parallel with new technologies, algorithms, artificial intelligence to flag these transactions. And I know that banks are already investing in those technologies, but I think we could always do more to encourage that.
Well, and Mr. Reynolds, this was, I wanted to go next to how can we leverage technology, and specifically following up on what Mr. Marino referred to, be it artificial analysis, the data analytics, which you've talked about quite a bit, or something else to make these suspicious activity reports more valuable. And I see that, and I should have thought about this before the hearing when I was preparing, but when Mr. Marino said we've got to have the bodies to review them too, we forget that's a huge piece on the back end of it. But just how would we leverage this technology even better?
Sure. I'm a huge believer in the big data and technology, but I agree with you that it really has to be a combination of human effort and technology. Technology will only get you so far. I think the first step is to really use technology to look for outliers, because ultimately a lot of these folks are trying to look like everyone else. That's sort of the point of what they're trying to do, but fundamentally they aren't like everyone else. And so there are at times telltale signs. Now, it may be that we can't tell the difference without the law enforcement information. In some cases we can. And so I think what we need to do is leverage as much as we can big data to pull together and to recognize that when the BSA system was formed 40 years ago now, we were paper, no cell phones, no internet. Now we're high-speed wire transactions, internet, and paper money is in many ways not king anymore. Yeah. So I think recognizing that and leveraging the data abilities we have is key, but then I agree with you. Then I think what we need to do is try to take those precious resources we have, which are the human resources, and I think really focus them on the most important national security issues. I think right now we're sort of spread across the whole waterfront. In my view, I think what would be better is to really focus them on the most serious threats and not spread them against what I would consider to be the less serious threats.
And I was going to move on to something else, but what would you define as the most serious threats?
I think when we're, I would expect in many cases law enforcement would ultimately provide that to us and they would tell the institutions what are the most serious threats. But I think from my perspective, looking at things like terrorism, human trafficking, serious money laundering, serious fraud, cyber activities, those would be the areas where I would most like to focus resources. And I think if we did that, I think that we would provide more valuable intelligence on these national security issues.
Yeah, that's helpful. When you said it, I was thinking in terms of size and scope as opposed to the actual what the issue was. Yes. Mr. Levitt, I want to go back to the private sector. Can you talk some more about how we can get more people in the private sector to first recognize that what they're looking at is not normal? I think they do typically see things that are out of the ordinary, but we still, I think, are hesitant to raise the red flag and call authorities and say, there's something you need to look at here. Are there some other things we should be doing to try and encourage people in the private sector to notice or be observant of things out of the ordinary and report them?
So I guess I'd challenge the premise. I think the banks are actually quite good at this, and they're quite eager to be good. If anything, there's been an over-reporting of SARS to be overly cautious. I think the big issue is that if you have in a truest lone wolf, you will not have outliers, you will not have telltale signs, there'll be nothing to look at unless law enforcement for some other investigative angle happens to know that there's something going on, and then the bank can say, well, wait a minute, this guy's only taking out $100 every 2 weeks, but he's never done that before, and suddenly $100 is the issue, not...
I see my time has run out, but I would point out, I'm thinking more of this testimony earlier, and I thought it was you, talking about mental health issues. They exhibit things beforehand, typically, and we've got to figure out a way to observe that and report it. This is what we had reported in the St. Cloud stabbing. There were mental health concerns before this incident, and I see my time's expired.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our guests. I really appreciate your testimony, and thanks for your expertise. Mr. Reynolds, you work in the private sector for a financial institution, and I'm just curious. Barclays is publicly traded, right? So I don't know. I haven't personally looked at the annual report closely enough to know how much do you actually spend on reporting for suspicious activity. Just how much of that annual budget goes to this?
Honestly, I don't know the exact figure. I know that it's fairly substantial in terms of staff, but I couldn't give you an exact figure. I apologize.
Okay. No, that's all right. And I guess my question is given that it's a substantial figure, it's not a insignificant figure that's down in the footnotes as rounded out, but it may be summed up in the other operating costs somewhere. How much revenue does this generate for Barclays?
Zero.
Zero. Okay, so my question is when we listen to these Part B discussions about, frankly, some of the financial institutions anxious to start collaborating with one another and sharing information across each other for a portion of their bank that drives zero revenue for the bank, why is it that banks are so ready to engage in law enforcement activity that generates nothing of value for the company? I mean, I really appreciate that you want to help with national security. I guess my question is, why?
I think it's fairly simply that I think the bank wants to do the right thing. I think that certainly the bank does not want to bank terrorists. It doesn't want to bank money launderers. It doesn't want to bank human traffickers. And so certainly, regardless of law enforcement impact, the bank wouldn't want these individuals in our bank anyway. So I think the bank would spend money and dedicate resources to make sure that we don't have those sorts of customers. I think there's an attendant law enforcement benefit as well, but I think certainly just from wanting to be a good corporate citizen and doing the right thing, the bank doesn't want to bank these people.
Okay, so defensively. So that's, I mean, fundamentally, you have something to gain because your bank would have a bad reputation if you became known as the destination for human trafficking financing, for example. So there's a defensive interest in it for the banks. I guess when you look at it, you say, all right, know your customer, know these activities, and you go beyond, you know, maybe to open this up to Dr. Levitt, Mr. Moreno, how we've spent a fair bit of time on privacy. And I guess my question is we're down to the point where we're talking about tracking knife purchases and using big data. You know, it's already bad enough you can't fly with a knife. Certain size knives you go, okay, but, you know, nail clippers, maybe we got past some of that. Things like this. At some point, does owning a knife need to be on a suspicious report? If I bought a set of knives for the kitchen, do we need to investigate all those? I guess you see how far down we are into the dialogue, and you have private sector folks that are going to spend more and more, add 2 or 3 floors to the building to focus on this, not to mention all the resources we devote to doing this. And in the balance is privacy for people. How do we make sure that we can do, because there's always, well, we could always do more. But in this case, this happened. I guess, when the federal government operated the post office, as we do still today, and there weren't tons of rivals, the government actually still had possession of the data, and they sent it from point A to point B, and without a warrant, they didn't open it up. Lots of things could have been in the mail, but officially, we didn't search every package. As far as I know, FedEx doesn't open every package that gets sent, yet if it's financial data, fundamentally, you don't have anywhere near the same safeguards. So I guess, how do we get that balance right?
I guess I'd just say in a nutshell that you ultimately do have pretty much that same protection. We're not looking at every transaction. We couldn't look at every transaction. Even if we wanted to, and we don't, no one's looking at every knife purchase. The whole point is to be focusing only on those cases where through a variety of different investigative tools, whether it's financial or the community coming forward or intelligence or whatever it is, that there's reason to believe, to have suspicion that something is off. And we have clear requirements for what hits threshold, and as Mr. Hughes talked about, sometimes we can't hit threshold on terrorism, and so we do something else. You don't want to overreact and say, well, now people are using knives, so knives are the big problem. They're not. But you also want to recognize that because a knife is inexpensive, you can't just assume that the kind of things you had put in place to notice something just under a $10,000 threshold is going to catch this.
Yep.
So
thanks. My time has expired and we're tight, so you'll bet.
Time has expired. We recognize now the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank the chairman. Thank the ranking member. It's an important hearing. Thanks for having it. Little Rock has had its own situation with a lone wolf back in June of 2009 when a dry cleaners worker from Memphis who was opening up a new location in Little Rock had become radicalized, and at 10 o'clock in the morning went up and shot at point-blank range 2 Army recruiters there, killing one of them, Andy Long, and wounding my friend, Private Quentin Exawela. Tragic deal. So I appreciate having this hearing. And my predecessor, Tim Griffin, and I worked hard for Easy and Andy to earn the Purple Heart for that tragedy. I just was reading a book during August, In the Skin of a Jihadist, which is a book about radicalization in France and just how few dollars are used in this arena. So I'm very sensitive to this issue of a lone wolf, and having seen it in reality in Arkansas and then reading about just how modest the financing is in this arena and just how prevalent it's become in Europe. So for banks of all sizes, Mr. Reynolds, I'm just curious if there is off-the-shelf, software for their operation instead of the kind of expense that Barclays or Bank America would have to go to that do integrate data to make filing a SAR a more sophisticated, activity rather than just the bank transaction that goes across the counter or through the wire room, where a bank of any size can note disposable cell phone purchases and tickets purchased to certain countries on the credit card, if in fact they're a credit card issuer. Tell me how a bank could really enhance their SAR filing from the obvious, because that is one of the things we file SARs in banks just based on things that we observe. We don't actually go hunting for SARs. So now maybe perhaps Barclays does. So talk to me the difference between seeing something that's suspicious and then I have a staff that's hunting through all my customers looking for something that's suspicious.
Sure. There's really two ways to attack the problem, and some institutions just employ one, some institutions employ both. To your point about commercially available solutions, there are a great number of commercially available solutions that can range from solutions for very, very small banks. So it's a solution that's tailored for a small community bank that will look for various red flag indicators and will ultimately push those to the relevant AML officer. Very often a small community bank, there isn't hordes of people, there is an AML officer. And that's the person who
do many jobs,
who has many, many hats and works incredibly hard to review and works very hard in those institutions. That software is incredibly useful to them because it does help them identify some of those transactions.
Does it bring in non-bank data, though? Does it integrate non-bank data at all?
So for some of the smaller solutions, it typically would not. There are other commercially available solutions that will, for instance, bring in negative news on customers. So if there's public available news on your customers, it will bring that in. There are some solutions that even go out and look on the web to see if there's derogatory information about customers you may have that will bring that in as well. The second set of solutions that you typically have for institutions are what I refer to as sort of advanced analytics. A lot of different great companies that are doing some fantastic work in this area. And what those solutions are is, to your point, of institutions proactively looking for risks within the institution. So that's where, again, they're not looking at individual customers per se until they find something, but what they are doing is looking across the data to look for outliers, to look for things that just don't make sense for their customer set, and then they focus analysts in on that particular issue. Most large institutions, in my experience, do both, because given their data sets, just having sort of a standard platform that's looking for red flags is good, and that's what's required, but most banks invest above and beyond what's required and do the proactive analytics as well. Smaller institutions, I think, probably stick to the former. But again, because they're smaller, I don't know that proactive analytics for a smaller institution would be quite as useful.
Quickly, you were talking about know your customer, sharing that information. You do acknowledge banks can call another bank and say, are you satisfied with your know your customer information about customer X? That's permitted under law, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's permitted under Section 314B.
Thank you very much,
The
Mr. Chairman.
gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank each one of our witnesses for your testimony today. You've been very gracious with your time and your answers. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for the response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as they're able. This hearing is adjourned.